Welcome back to another start to finish room renovation. This time we are tackling my parents' hallway. It's this wonky little space between the dining room and my parents' bedroom that I just finished. And I wanted to serve as a visual transition between the two, but I also wanted to be what I call a jewel box room, which is just one that's kind of like over the top with how pretty and beautiful it is and how many details it has. So no surface in this room will go untouched. If you are a minimalist, this room will not be for you. So some of the things I don't like about this hallway to start is that it had very bumpy textured walls, which I just hate in general. But I also want a wallpaper in here, so I need to smooth those out. It also has this really patchy glitter glue ceiling, and I love the attempt at adding glitter, but I don't really like the effect. It's just very patchy and splotchy, and I think we can do better. The other things I don't like are this giant air return, which just pops out like a feature. And then finally, there is this one little closet door that's painted, and it's the only painted door still left in the house. But the very first thing I always like to tackle is any structural changes, and the only one we need to do in here is my mom wants to put a piece of furniture right here, so we need to move the thermostat over the light switch. And my electrician, I love him, his name is Dan, and he always teaches me what he's working on, which is so nice. So he showed me how he moved this thermostat wire through the adjacent stud out into this new area using a wire coat hanger. So we got that moved over right over that light switch, and then he showed me how to patch that hole in the drywall as well and just filled that up with some spackle. And then while he was in the attic, I got to work skim coating these super bumpy walls. I get asked a lot about my tips for skim coating, and if you don't know, I have a whole course on DIY renovation, just the absolute basics, and I have a full lesson just on skim coating. So if you're just getting started with renovation and want to learn a lot of these basics, you can check out that course on my site. Once I got the whole room skim coated, then it was time for sanding, which is the absolute worst part, and unfortunately I ran out of filters for my shop vac, so it got super clogged and it filled the entire room and then the entire house with dust. And you can see that in this video, and it actually got so dusty in the house it set off a smoke alarm. So it was not a great time. I was not a very happy camper. And I also just hate sanding in general. It's probably my least favorite DIY activity. There are also no mirrors in the house. So when I got home to take a shower and looked in the mirror, I thought it was so funny. I got a glimpse of myself about 30 years in the future. You can even see where my band was on my headphones. My kitten had to come check it out. She was very judgmental, very rude. And then the next day I got started on prepping these walls for wallpaper. So I dusted the walls first with just a wet mop, let that dry, and then came in with a primer on this staining pad. This is, again, my new favorite hack because it doesn't splatter the primer or paint everywhere like a roller does. Got that all primed, and then we finally had a nice blank slate to work with. And the next step was adding a bunch of trim. First up is this picture rail that I added below the crown molding, and picture rail allows you to hang pictures over wallpaper without having to punch holes in it because it can just hang from a chain from the picture rail. I did have some parts in the wall that are just really funky, like this one had this little bump out here, and the picture rail would not bend around it. So I ended up removing it, cutting it shorter, and creating a joint right around that bend. And then I just filled the joint later. And if you're putting up trim, getting a laser measure like this is so handy because trying to get your tape measure to go all the way across the wall without collapsing is really annoying. So laser measure, highly recommend. Once I got the final pieces in place, this just felt a little bit bare to me. It felt like there was too much of a gap between the crown and the picture rail. So I decided I wanted to bulk it up a little bit by getting some more trim. And I got a little crafty. I went to the store and found this baseboard that had one little fluted end on the side, but I wanted both ends to have that little fluting to it. So I took my router with an OG bit, and the OG bit kind of creates this curved edge that looks really nice like trim. Ran that along the flat side, and then this baseboard became a really nice thick piece of trim with little decorative accents on both sides. I tested out up on the wall which side I preferred down. I decided I wanted the OG bit side down, and then got all of that nailed into place along the wall. This is one of those things where some people will call me out and say, you're crazy, it didn't need that. Okay, just wait till the end because it looks really pretty to have all of this stacked trim, in my opinion. And then we get to the really fun trim. I've never used this before. It's flexible trim. It feels like a giant rubber eraser, and it's also heavy. So how I did this, I got this pinned in place first with a few brad nails. You got to use your muscle to stretch it out over that curve. And then I took my speed square against the wall and marked where I needed to make my cuts. Then I pulled this off the arch to go cut it, and of course I nailed myself right in the chin, and I had a bump for several days. I actually hit myself pretty hard. And one of the sad things about doing DIY solo is that you have no one to complain to, so I just make funny faces at the camera. And then I went and cut my nice little rubber trim, and it cuts so funny. It creates this what I call like rubber spaghetti. Some people say it looks like string cheese, and my miter saw just kind of looks trashed now. I really need to get my shop vac on that. Then I took that arch trim back, nailed it in place, and then for the straight edges we're just using normal 1x4s. So I took my multi-tool and removed the shoe molding that's on top of the baseboard, just enough so I could slot that 1x4 in, and then I shot some brad nails in to hold it in place. And once we fill this, it'll be perfect seamless trim. Then I started skim coating the inside of the arch, and I know this is not the correct way to case a door. You will usually have trim on the inside as well. I have trimmed out a door before, but this is a special case because you can see that dining side of the wall has that shiplap feature wall, and my mom really did not want this to have trim on it, so we're getting a little crafty here. I'm just doing some skim coating on the inside, and then to get it around the curve of the arch, I couldn't use my taping knife, so I had to use this little putty knife. And I ended up doing 2 coats of this skim coat to get rid of all those bumps. Then I trimmed out the other arch and skim coated it just the same, and it filled all of the nail holes with spackle, and then all the joints between the trim with Bondo. And then lots and lots and lots of sanding, and sadly this was not the final bit of sanding, because whenever you're skim coating, there's usually these little pinholes that are left over from where there were air pockets in your skim coat. And if this was on a wall, I may not care as much, but because we're trying to make this look like trim, I did want to go back and fill all those pinholes. So I just used some spackle and then had to come back and sand it later. Not shown here, but I did prime all of that joint compound before I came in with my paint here. And I actually got the wrong shade of paint. So I wanted a shade called Dove White, and I sent my mom, and thank you mom for going to pick this out, but unfortunately she came back with Dover White. And you know what? It actually ended up being a very happy accident because I love this super creamy white in here, especially because this hallway is so shady. It doesn't get a ton of warm light. So the cooler light in here actually balances out some of those buttery tones in the cream, and it just becomes this really beautiful soft off-white, which is again a reminder to always test your paint colors in your exact light in your room because it will absolutely change depending on the quality of light it gets and how it looks throughout the day. And then it was finally time for my favorite part of this room, which is the wallpaper. It's so beautiful, and I am going to speed this up just to kind of show you how long it takes. And that first strip of wallpaper, aside from going around corners, is really the trickiest because you want to make sure that it's perfectly level. And to do that, I'm using a laser level, and this is going to make sure that your wallpaper isn't crooked all the way along the wall. So, you know, kind of important. And you can see me here really being finicky and moving it around a lot until I get that perfect alignment because it really is that important. But once you get that first strip up, it becomes a lot simpler. So the following strips, especially because there are no obstructions along this section of the wall, this went by pretty quickly. And I am in love with this wallpaper. It's called a chinoiserie style, which usually means it's like a nature mural scene. And this one has trees and butterflies and birds and flowers. And it's so pretty without looking too kind of gimmicky, in my opinion. I think it toes that line between cutesy and sophisticated. And here I just want to show you, it's super important when you're doing wallpaper to try to get that alignment of the pattern. This is where guests will come in, and even if they don't know anything about DIY, they'll be able to say that looks wrong, just because if the pattern is not aligning, it's going to be really obvious. So try your hardest to get that alignment perfect for each panel. And then for pieces like this where there's actually a lot of waste, because I cut off everything that falls below the door trim, it's really nice because I save those rolls and can use them for future little craft projects where I just need a little bit of wallpaper in the background. But this was actually the start of my wallpaper problems in here, and I want to show you all of them and how I fixed them. So first up, like I showed you before with the trim, there are some humps on these walls, and that makes it really hard to get that wallpaper to align. So that created some gaps between the sheets of wallpaper, which showed that white background of the wall behind. And a way you can kind of get around this is if you paint the wall beforehand with the background color of your wallpaper. But what that still won't hide is the white edges of the wallpaper. So how I like to fix this when it happens is to take a color matched paint to the background of the wallpaper, paint that on with a little artist brush, rub it into the cracks, and then immediately remove it with a little wet wipe. And you want to work in sections here because you don't want that paint to dry on the wallpaper. You want to move really quickly. And once this dries, it will really help to disguise all of these little gaps. The next issue I already knew was going to happen, which is that it was going to be really hard to cut around these curved edges of the arches. So I actually planned ahead for this and bought some flexible trim in shoe molding, got that all painted to match the rest of the trim, and then put that around the top of the arches, and then just used some straight shoe molding beneath for the straight edges. And I also think this helps to make the trim look a little more proportional anyway, so it's kind of a win-win, and it covers up all of the little jagged edges of the paper. And then the final problem I had is that I had 2 inches of wiggle room at the start of the wallpaper up top, but the ceiling actually rose 2.5 inches around the room, which means it left this little gap up at the top, which was very rude. But I've encountered this problem before, so all I did was just get some screen molding, use my miter shears to cut that so I didn't have to use my saw, and then nailed that in place, and then no one needs to know that there is this little gap up here. So pretty. And then now the next problem to tackle is that glitter glue ceiling. And I know there are going to be some people who say, just paint the ceiling white, but we are going for a jewel box room. So we're using tin ceiling tiles. And I bought these unfinished to save money and then spray painted them in a couple different options. And I also like this because I'm picky. And if I had ordered the wrong color, I would have been really upset with myself. So unfinished is the way for me. I tested a couple different options. One's called warm gold and the other is champagne bronze. And ironically, warm gold actually ended up having cool tones, which I think work best with that sage green wallpaper. So that is the one I chose, and I got all of them spray painted and then started putting them up on the ceiling. And this was really straightforward for me because it's solid wood above the drywall on the ceiling. And that's only because this is an old house. But typically for your house, you'll probably need to install a layer of plywood or furring strips up along the studs of your ceilings so that these have something to connect to and they just don't fall right off your drywall. Then we had a little bit of drama when my phone decided to fall. Thankfully, it was not me falling off the ladder. And then we got back to it. And then for these little edges on the side, I used my sheet metal cutters. And I 1000% recommend using some really heavy duty gloves with this because once you cut this metal, it is razor sharp. And yes, I did bleed a couple times. Got those little pieces stuck in place. And then for the light in here, I'm gonna disappoint some of you. I do really love this starlight, but it has this really yellow gold tone throughout that doesn't work with this kind of cooler brass tone ceiling. But I did find another place for it in the back entry, so don't worry, it's not getting thrown out or anything. And for the tile that goes here, I had to make this little round cutout, and I just used a little electrical pancake box and traced that, drilled a hole on the edge, and then in that drill hole, I inserted the scissors and was able to cut out the hole. Got that pinned in place, and then it's time to get our new light, which is in the front bathroom. I have plans for a different light in here already, and this also just doesn't light this bathroom very well, so it's nice to be able to reuse it in the hallway. It's this beautiful vintage brass chandelier. It lights this hallway really beautifully, and then look at this close up. Isn't this perfect? The floral pattern actually matches the floral pattern on the wallpaper, and the brass matches the ceiling brass color perfectly. And here's the little contrast with how the yellow gold of that star just really wasn't working with the ceiling. So ideally with a tin ceiling, what you want to do is install it before you install the crown molding so you can hide all these scraggly little cut edges. But since we went out of order, we are using a DIYer's best friend again, which is adding even more trim. And the nice thing about this is the more trim I add to the stacked trim, the more ornate and fancy it looks, which is ideal. So again, I'm just using a little layer of screen molding, and I caulked all the gaps between the trim and painted them to make everything look really seamless. And this is what it looked like after. Some people are going to say, this is too extra, it's too much, Renee, but that's what we're going for in here. It's a small space, and I feel like it can be maximalist without overwhelming the rest of the house. And just look how perfect that chandelier is. All right, final steps in here I actually started earlier in the project. So first off, I want to get rid of this air return eyesore. And my favorite way to do this is just to camouflage it into the background. So I started by removing the front grille, and I set my ladder a little too close. So I just did a little very professional and safe wiggle of the ladder over. Don't try that at home. Got the front grille off and then painted the trim to match the background of the wallpaper. Then I went online to see how much it would cost to get a fancy air return cover replacement, and it would have been $175 for one this big. So I decided I would make my own, and I went to the store and found some slim pieces of wood to build this frame out of. Got those pieces cut on my miter saw, and for some of them I wanted to slim them down a bit, so I took them to my table saw and got them cut because I wanted this to be as low profile as possible on the air return. So this is a really snug fit. Then I got everything cut and started assembling, but just using some wood glue and then these miter clamps that are one of my favorite things. And everything was going swimmingly until I realized that I cut those pieces way too short. I still don't know how that happened. So then I had to go back and get these little pieces that I could cobble on, a little wood glue and some more clamping later. And I got the side and top pieces of that vent cover ready. Once I removed all my clamps, I then put some glue on and glued them together and then clamped them again. In any kind of glue and clamp situation, the more clamps, the better. Once they were nice and stuck together, then I took some spackle and spackled all of the joints and sides to make everything look seamless, sanded everything down, and then primed it, and then finally painted it the background color of the wallpaper. I also bought a metal screen at the store to go inside, and I also painted this the background color of the wallpaper. Then it was time to put those two things together. So first I did a little dry fit, and then I brought out these little corner braces I bought to just add a little bit more sturdiness to this frame. But because the pieces of wood are so thin, I didn't want to use screws. So instead I'm just using Gorilla Glue to put everything together. And when you're using Gorilla Glue, you need to have some water on it to activate it. So one side of the pieces you're clamping on needs to have some water. So I just took a little damp sponge and wiped that along the wood, and then started gluing my corner braces on and then putting the glue on for the screen. And with Gorilla Glue, you also need to clamp it down. So to do this, I just used some heavy pieces I had laying around like spackle and Bondo and little quarts of paint, anything to just keep that screen down pressed into that glue so that it sets nice and tight. The final step here was to add on the command strip, and I did have some people ask, really, a command strip? You think that's going to hold it? This command strip is rated for 15 pounds, and this screen cover definitely only weighs a few pounds, so it holds it really nice and tight. I did cut it in half so it would just fit along that thin piece of wood on the top. Did a little dry fit in place, and it was a perfect fit. I always love when that happens. And then tested removing it, putting it back on, and it works perfectly. And I love how flush it gets on the side so that it completely covers all of the metal and that air return. Now, don't judge this too harshly until you see it with the lights off, because my camera makes it look the wrong color when the light's on, but see how it just blends nicely into the wallpaper, and now it's not the focus of the room when you walk in. You can look at all the other beautiful details in here. The final step in here is stripping this little closet door, and if you are ever stripping painted hardware and you can't put your screwdriver in those slots of the screws, just use some citrus strip and let it lay on there for a couple days, and then you can put your screwdriver in. So we got the door removed, and then it was time for stripping. And definitely lay out a bunch of plastic. It's gonna be messy and gloppy. I got my sawhorses out, put the door on, and then started working with my citrus strip. And I pulled out a new container of citrus strip, and it is super stinky this time. Usually citrus strip for me is fairly mild of a scent, but this one was terrible. I don't know if they changed their formula or if I just got a bad one or what, but it stunk up the whole house. Then we have some really satisfying paint stripping for you. I do find with citrus strip that you have to do multiple coats of it, because just one clearly is only removing some of the top layers of paint. There's still some left underneath. But after a second coat of the citrus strip and letting it sit a couple more days, I was able to get the rest of the paint off, and it left me with this really beautiful wood. And I just when it's this pretty, I wonder why people even painted it to begin with. It's obviously so beautiful. At this point, I feel comfortable enough to sand the rest of it off, especially wearing a respirator and having a shot vac with a HEPA filter hooked up to it. Got it nice and clean, and then pulled out my gel stain. And yes, a gel stain is going to cover up some of that beautiful grain, but I do want this to match the rest of the doors in this house that all have this really dark gel stain on them. And I'm going to be the first to admit that this is a bit patchy, and I think that's because all of the paint residue wasn't completely removed from the door, but you'll see it actually works out just fine because the corner is so shadowy that you can't even see the streaks. While I sealed that and let it dry, I also got to work on the hardware. So first I stripped off all of the paint and then used some rub and buff and some spray enamel to make it look like antique brass, which is one of my favorite ways to restore rusting antique hardware. Got it reassembled, and now this beautiful little closet door matches the rest of the doors in this house, including the other door in the hallway, which is why it looked so out of place. So now these two doors match, and it just makes more sense. Final step in here is just cleaning up the floors. So I started by removing my RAM board. And if you've ever wondered what a clogged up shop vac filter looks like that's full of drywall dust, this is what it is. It does not work anymore. You'll just notice that your shop vac has no suction. Here's what a new filter looks like. And then this is what a really good shop vac is going to be doing for you. It's basically me lifting up that paper. It's so strong. Got all of my protective paper out of the way, vacuumed up the rest of this dust, and then I got to work painting the baseboards. I ended up doing, I think, 3 coats of this just to make sure I covered up all that old tan. And here's a reminder of this hallway before. And here's the after. Again, I set out to make this room look like a jewel box, and I think I made it work. It's so beautiful. I'm seriously in love with this wallpaper. I want to steal it. I can't believe this is in my parents' house because I want to take it and use it my own. Same thing for the ceiling. I just think it's so beautiful. I love how the chandelier looks with it, and all of the brass tones match the antique brass hardware on the doors. And I love how that air return cover now just kind of disappears into the wallpaper more. Your eye isn't drawn straight to it, and it's just a beautiful, beautiful little room. And it also transitions really perfectly from the green of the ceiling and the shiplap in the dining room right into this hallway. Now that you've seen the full makeover, I'd love to know if you have a favorite detail, so please leave it in the comments. And let me know if you have any questions about this room. I will link as many sources as I can in the description. But yeah, I just love how this turned out. This is definitely a room for the maximalists, and I hope you love it as much as I do.